At 8:53 a.m. on January 5, 2022, a desperate text message lit up a phone screen in Detroit. "Are you alive?" The sender, 17-year-old Vertez Gonzalez, had been trying to reach his girlfriend all night. His final message captured the growing dread. This is the worst thing ever. Zion Foster, a high school senior with dreams of getting her own apartment, had vanished. Her last known location placed her at the home of someone she trusted completely, her favourite cousin. But when her mother reached out to him for help finding her daughter, his response would set off a chain of lies that would unravel into one of Detroit's most disturbing family betrayals. Today's case exposes how a young woman's life was stolen by the very person she called family, and how digital breadcrumbs led investigators through a maze of deception. Let's take a look. Sierra Milton awoke that January morning to find her eldest daughter's bed empty. The mother of 6 had watched 17-year-old Zion walk out their front door the night before, just before 11 p.m. The teenager had been honest about her plans. She was going to spend time with her cousin Jaylen Brazier, something she did once or twice a month. Sierra had no reason for concern. Zion had just finished her serving shift at the Detroit Wing Company and asked permission before leaving. Everything seemed routine, but by morning nothing was routine anymore. Zion's phone went straight to voicemail. Messages sent throughout the night showed as undelivered. The last communication anyone received from her was a text to Vertez at 12:59 a.m. that simply read, "OMW, on my way." She never made it home. When Sierra contacted Jaylen Brazier for help locating her daughter, his response was immediate and shocking. He hadn't seen Zion in years, he claimed. The 23-year-old father of 2 expressed frustration at being dragged into the situation. Through text messages, he called Zion's claims about spending time with him sneaky as hell and not safe. He suggested she must know someone else in his neighbourhood, maybe using him as a cover story. He helpfully advised Sierra to contact police but requested to be kept out of it. -3. This denial might have been more convincing if not for one crucial piece of evidence. Vertez, admittedly insecure about his relationship, had been tracking Zion's location through her phone. At exactly 11:24 p.m. on January 4th, he had taken a screenshot showing her location directly across from Jaylen's house on the street where he lived. When confronted with this evidence, Jaylen doubled down. He sent Vertez a video from his Ring camera system, claiming it showed no sign of Zion entering his home that night. East Point police initially treated the case with little urgency. Officers at the station were blunt with Sierra. According to the distressed mother, they specifically told her they were taking this as a runaway case. The dismissive response stemmed from Zion's history. The teenager had threatened to run away before and had actually done so the previous year, twice fleeing to her grandmother's house when she was 16. She had been struggling with her grandmother's recent cancer diagnosis and her own desire for independence. But Sierra knew this time was different. Her daughter had been working steadily, talking about prom, planning to get an apartment. She wasn't running away. With law enforcement dragging their feet, Sierra mobilized family and friends. They posted flyers, held rallies, spoke to media. "We need your eyes. The police need your help," they pleaded to the community. The family created social media campaigns, organized search parties that combed through neighborhoods, and contacted local businesses to check security footage. Sierra personally visited locations Zion frequented, desperate for any trace of her daughter. Eventually, officers were dispatched to speak with Jaylen Brazier at his home. The story he told them was consistent with what he'd told Sierra. He hadn't seen his cousin, technically his first cousin through Sierra's ex-husband, since May 2021, nearly a year before. He invited officers to search his house. They found nothing suspicious. Jaylen continued his narrative that Zion was known to be a runaway who had fled 4 times before, always ending up at some boyfriend's house. He insisted her mother was playing it a certain way that made him uncomfortable and that the teenager had never been in his house. But Sierra Milton wasn't buying it. She had personally watched Zion leave with Jaylen multiple times. She'd greeted him in her driveway when he came to pick up her daughter. His claim of not seeing her for 3 years was, in her words, "impossible when you were in my driveway and gave me a hug." The truth began to emerge when investigators checked doorbell camera footage from Jaylen's neighbor. At approximately 11:15 p.m. on January 4th, a white sedan, known to be Jaylen's car, pulled into his driveway. 2 individuals clearly emerged and walked into the house, one male, one female. Jaylen had driven his girlfriend Katrina to her midnight shift at a manufacturing job just before 11 p.m. She worked from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. The second person entering the house could not have been her. Phone location data would later confirm what the camera showed. Those two individuals were Jaylen Brazier and Zion Foster. The same camera captured something else. At 1:41 a.m, Jaylen's car pulled out of the driveway, then backed in so the trunk faced the backyard. After a few minutes, the car drove off, returning less than 10 minutes later. The camera never showed Zion leaving the house. Search warrants were obtained for both the house and the vehicle. The house search yielded nothing, but when investigators brought in cadaver dogs, the animals clearly indicated on the trunk of Jaylen's car. On January 19th, 15 days after Zion's disappearance, Jaylen Brazier voluntarily sat down with detectives, accompanied by a friend who was a lawyer. He was ready to tell what he claimed was the truth. In this new version of events, Jaylen admitted he had indeed picked up Zion from her home and brought her to his house. After putting his two young sons, aged 1 and 2, to bed, he joined Zion in the living room where they smoked marijuana and talked. She told him about how her relationship with her mother had improved, about her boyfriend, about prom, about her job, and her plans to get an apartment. Then, he claimed, something went terribly wrong. Zion suddenly blanked out after he got up to get himself a drink. When he returned, she appeared to be sleeping with her head tilted back on the couch. After waiting 15 to 20 minutes, he tried to wake her to take her home, but she wasn't responding. He described her pulse as faint, then non-existent. Her breathing, he said, was not existing. His 17-year-old cousin, he claimed, had simply died on his couch. Instead of calling 911, he panicked. His explanation was that he feared it would look like he had killed her. So he made a decision that would haunt everyone involved. He placed Zion's body in his trunk, drove to Highland Park, and disposed of her in a dumpster. Cell phone records would confirm his phone's presence at those dumpsters at 1:48 a.m. on January 5th. When detectives pressed him on how he could be certain she was dead and why he didn't call for help, Jaylen insisted he couldn't feel a heartbeat or detect breathing, so he assumed she was dead. Definitely, he added. At the dumpster location in Highland Park, Jaylen walked investigators through his actions that night. He indicated which dumpster he had used, the one on the right, which had already been open when he arrived. But weeks had passed. The dumpsters had long since been emptied. Zion's body was gone. Sierra Milton's reaction to learning what Jaylen claimed to have done was one of horror and disbelief. Her daughter had been thrown away, like she was trash, she said, by someone who was supposed to be family. Over the following months, Jaylen's story would shift dramatically. First, it was marijuana that killed her. Then he claimed they had taken acid. By June, he would recant the acid story entirely, admitting he had lied and felt pressured by police. Other details shifted too. Sometimes Zion was on the couch, sometimes on the floor. These constant changes would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case against him. Without a body, and without an admission of harm, prosecutors could only charge him with lying to police, a charge that carried a maximum of 4 years in prison. While Jaylen sat in custody, investigators made a horrifying discovery. Despite claiming he hadn't performed a factory reset on his phone since Zion's death, records showed he had wiped his device completely just 2 days after disposing of her body. But some data survived in cloud storage. His Google searches from January 7th, 3 days after dumping his cousin's body, told a chilling story. Are garbage trucks also compactors? What is the force of a garbage truck compactor? How do police get your phone history? How do you know if police are watching you? Even more disturbing were searches from before the murder. In the months leading up to January 4th, Jaylen had repeatedly searched for pornographic content using the terms cousin and step-cousin. Experts retrieved the actual videos from these searches, some of which were described as violent and graphic in nature. The prosecution would argue these searches revealed a dark obsession that had been building for months before that fatal night. Wayne County launched a massive search operation at local landfills. Garbage trucks working in Highland Park were tracked to specific areas where their loads were dumped. For nearly 6 months, over 70 volunteers and law enforcement personnel, wearing masks and hazmat suits, systematically picked through mountains of trash looking for any sign of Zion. The search area covered nearly 100 acres of landfill, with investigators sifting through an estimated 11,750 tons of waste material. In June 2022, Jaylen appeared for sentencing on the lying charge. He pleaded his case to the judge, claiming he had turned himself in, and that while he had lied, he wasn't in the right state of mind. He insisted there was no way to prepare for such a situation, that he was scared and didn't know exactly how she died or what caused it. He admitted reacting stupidly off of fear and panic, and wished he could take it back, that he would have called an ambulance or her mother. He even claimed to the judge that after struggling for 2 years to get their current home, everything was falling down, and he didn't know who to call with his children upstairs. The judge was unmoved. Jaylen was sentenced to 23 months, but served only 9 before being granted early release through a 90-day boot camp program, a military-style incarceration program that promised rehabilitation and self-improvement in exchange for reduced sentences. While Jaylen was in custody, his phone calls home were monitored closely. He would sometimes use other inmates' calling codes to try to keep conversations private. He also obtained a prohibited cell phone, using it to exchange thousands of messages with his girlfriend Katrina. Repeatedly, he would ask if anything major had happened, poorly concealed attempts to learn whether the landfill search had found anything. As the search neared its end, he referred to it obliquely, telling Katrina to stop the rock thing and expressing relief when she assured him there were no major developments. In one call, he told her to keep your head up, and when she began to speak about certain things, he quickly cut her off, saying stop talking. His relief when nothing was found was telling. If his story were true, if Zion had died suddenly from an unknown cause, he should have wanted her found. Finding her body would exonerate him. Instead, he expressed relief with each passing day that she remained missing. The prosecution would later argue this demonstrated clear consciousness of guilt. Jaylen's freedom after serving his sentence would be short-lived. During his time outside, he returned to his home with Katrina and their children, attempting to resume normal life. But investigators had never stopped building their case. On June 13, 2023, after a year and a half of investigation, Detroit police finally obtained a warrant for Jaylen's arrest on murder charges. The 24-year-old was taken into custody during a routine traffic stop, with officers calmly verifying his identity before making the arrest. Upon his arrest, 2 additional cell phones were seized. Most damning were over 4,000 text messages retrieved from Zion's old phone that her mother had provided to police. The messages between Zion and Jaylen range from subtle and unsettling to explicitly inappropriate. Jaylen routinely invited her to his house when his girlfriend was away. He offered to let her stay in his basement if she ran away from home. He advised her on evading police if she ran away again. The messages revealed Jaylen's unhealthy fixation on his younger relative. He frequently praised her intelligence and appearance, while asking inappropriate questions about how others perceived their relationship. He even suggested that people assumed they were a couple, and claimed his girlfriend Katrina was jealous of her. At times, he boasted about his ability to attract women, calling himself a god. In one particularly troubling exchange, he told her that she understood him better than anyone else, and that their bond was unlike ordinary family connections. Prosecutor Ryan Elsey later told the jury that the 23-year-old had been manipulating his cousin for years, and that on January 4th his behaviour crossed into devastating reality. The trial revealed another crucial detail. On the very day Jaylen brought Zion to his house, he had learned that Katrina was pregnant with their 3rd child. Messages between the couple showed how he lied about his whereabouts after dropping her at work. When she became ill during her shift, experiencing nausea and hot spells that had sent her to the emergency room earlier, she begged him to pick her up. At 1:25 a.m, she wrote that she needed to come home. A minute later, she said she didn't feel good. Minutes after that, she described stomach pain, feeling sick, and getting hot and cold. Jaylen's response was dismissive. "You can make it, baby." He didn't pick her up until nearly 3 a.m. When he did, she noticed a deep scratch across his collarbone, deep enough to draw blood. He claimed the cat had done it. Katrina thought it odd. Their cat had never scratched that deeply before. She would later testify that the scratch looked more like defensive wounds from human fingernails than anything their pet could have caused. The prosecution also revealed that Jaylen had conducted additional disturbing searches after Zion's death. On January 8th, he searched, "How long does DNA last? Can you get DNA from a dead body?" and "How to clean blood from car trunk." These searches, combined with his earlier queries about garbage truck compactors, painted a picture of someone desperately trying to cover his tracks. At trial, which began in May 2024, the prosecution called 32 witnesses. The defense called none. Jaylen chose not to testify. A forensic anthropologist who reviewed Zion's medical records testified that the only condition she had that could potentially cause sudden death was asthma. But an asthma attack would present as the exact opposite of what Jaylen described. Instead of quietly passing out with a faint heartbeat, she would have been visibly struggling to breathe, clearly in distress. The expert testified that in their professional opinion, based on the medical evidence and Jaylen's own description of events, natural death was highly unlikely. The defense attempted to argue that Zion had suffered from seizures. Vertes testified that Zion had told him she took medication for epilepsy, and that without it, seizures became more frequent. He described seeing her briefly become faint once, slouching forward before recovering. But Sierra Milton testified that her daughter had never suffered seizures, and hundreds of pages of medical records supported the mother's assertion. While her youngest child did have such a condition, Zion did not. The prosecution pointed out that Zion had apparently been telling different stories to different people, a teenager's typical fibbing that Jaylen was now trying to exploit to escape justice. Digital forensics experts testified about the cell phone evidence. They explained how Jaylen's phone and Zion's phone travelled together from her home to his house. At 1:15 a.m, Zion's phone disconnected from the network, the exact time she stopped responding to messages. Jaylen's phone then travelled alone to the Highland Park dumpsters at 1:48 a.m, returning home by 2 a.m. This digital trail was impossible to explain away. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its simplicity. They pointed out that Jaylen brought Zion to his house late at night behind his pregnant girlfriend's back. She left that house in the trunk of his car on a night when he sustained an unexplained gash on his collarbone. The prosecutor asked the jury directly what they thought happened inside that house. The defense tried to maintain the seizure theory, arguing that Jaylen had simply panicked over a medical emergency. They pointed out that marijuana was essentially decriminalized, equivalent to a parking ticket. "You ever hear of somebody getting rid of a body to avoid a parking ticket?" they asked. They argued the prosecution had tunnel vision from the start, immediately focusing on Jaylen without considering other possibilities. But the evidence was overwhelming. The grooming messages, the pornographic searches, the lies to police, the factory reset of his phone, the Google searches about garbage trucks, the scratch on his collarbone, the monitored jail calls hoping nothing would be found. Every piece pointed to guilt. The jury needed only 30 minutes to reach their verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of tampering with evidence. At his sentencing hearing, Jaylen maintained his innocence one final time. He insisted the picture was already painted in everyone's minds, but that Zion was not harmed in any way. He claimed he had tried to apologize but knew his apologies meant nothing. Judge Donald Knapp outlined Jaylen's complete failure to accept responsibility. The father had left his two young children alone in a house with what he claimed was a dead body. He had manipulated and lied to family. He had shown no remorse for disposing of Zion's body like garbage. The judge stated it was unlikely he would ever be rehabilitated. Jaylen Brazier was sentenced to 30 to 90 years for murder, plus 5 to 10 years for tampering with evidence, to be served consecutively. Sierra Milton's reaction captured both grief and vindication. Her body trembled as the verdict was read, but she expressed happiness that justice was served. She said Zion was loved, was fought for, and the result proved it. Addressing Jaylen directly in her statement, she said he thought he was smart and tried to be slick, but people saw him for what he was. She expressed hope that he would never be released. Despite the exhaustive 6-month search involving heavy machinery and dozens of volunteers sorting through mountains of refuse, Zion Foster's body has never been recovered. The massive undertaking at the landfill was finally called off when it became clear that too much time had passed and too much additional waste had been deposited. The teenager who had dreams of getting her own apartment, who was excited about prom, who trusted her favourite cousin enough to spend time with him that January night, remains missing. Her mother and 5 siblings are left with justice but without closure, without a place to mourn, without a body to bury. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the grotesque violation of trust. Jaylen Brazier wasn't a stranger who attacked a vulnerable teenager. He was family. He was the cousin she went to when she needed to talk, when she was fighting with her mother, when she needed a safe space. Those 4,000 text messages recovered from her old phone painted a picture of years-long grooming, a deliberate cultivation of trust that he would ultimately exploit in the worst possible way. The digital evidence that survived despite Jaylen's attempts to destroy it tells the story he tried so hard to hide. Every search about garbage truck compactors, every deleted message, every monitored phone call from jail hoping nothing major would be found. They all pointed to consciousness of guilt. An innocent man whose cousin died suddenly of natural causes would want her found. A guilty man would Google the crushing force of garbage trucks. And that was the tragic case of Zion Foster, whose life was stolen by the very person she should have been able to trust most. A teenager with her whole future ahead of her, reduced to being disposed of like trash by someone who claimed to love her like family, because he was family. Jaylen Brazier will spend the next several decades behind bars, eligible for parole only when he's in his late 50s at the earliest. For Sierra Milton and her family, the search for answers may be over, but the search for Zion continues.